Our speaker today, Dr. Judith Taylor, has done presentations for us in the past, and today she will be talking about her 7th book, Women in Gardens. Dr. Taylor is a retired neurologist and is quoted as saying she is practicing horticulture without a license. Her earlier books include The Olive in California, The History of an Immigrant Tree, published in 2000, Tangible Memories, Californians in Their Gardens from 1800 to 1850, published in 2003, Global Migrations of Ornamental Plants, How the World Got into Your Garden, published in 2009, Visions of Loveliness, Great Flower Greeters of the Past, published in 2014, and An Abundance of Flowers, More Great Flower Breeders of the Past, published in 2018. And then A 5-Year Plan for Geraniums, Glowing Flowers Commercially in East Germany from 1846 to 1889, published in 2019. Today, she will talk about her new book, Women and Gardens, Obstacles and Opportunities for Women Gardeners Throughout History. When Susan Grove Bell died in 2015, she left a brief outline for a book with this title. Judith Taylor was given the opportunity to flesh out the book, and Judith has incorporated all of Susan's remaining notes in this book and added several additional chapters to illuminate the topic further. So please welcome Dr. Judith Taylor.
Thank you, Richard, very much for those kind words. And I indeed remember speaking to the Society on a couple of other occasions. I'm also delighted to know that several friends and family are in the audience, so I'm happy to greet them too. Joe, can you go back one slide, please? This is a picture of Susan Grove Bell, a very profoundly important woman scholar of women's history. She was out there very early. She spotted disparities in history as it's written down and history as it actually took place. She devoted her life really to repairing that deficit, that gap. She found things through examining art more thoroughly. She collected together various writings that supported her point. She compiled the very first academic guide to the study of women's history. She was very much involved in teaching all around the Bay Area, various different colleges and universities, and at the Stanford Center for Women's Studies. I consider it a great privilege when Professor Peter Stansky at Stanford asked me to pick up the threads of her work. Now, we're here today because this book celebrates the achievements of women in gardening and in horticulture, and you'll have to bear with me as I have somewhat elastic definitions. You'll see why as we proceed through this chat. I'm going to say a couple of words now about what actually happened in those years and years between roughly the late medieval period and the mid to late 19th century. If you were to ask me to draw a timeline of women's activities in gardening and or horticulture from about whatever, say 1400, it doesn't really matter, to the late 19th century, it would look rather like a very shallow U shape. Starting out at the origin in that early period, as Susan found and documented, women were just automatically considered to be the garden person in the family. It fell to the woman in the family to handle the garden. And by the garden, I mean an enclosed space, as distinct from an agricultural field or a wild wood, in which you plant seeds or other planting methods for food, for medicine, in some cases for textile, and only eventually for just plain beauty, the ornamental flower. And that was just how life was. The mother of any family took care of her family. She was the family doctor. She knew which herb to brew to make a tea or some other application to cure whatever symptoms you had. And of course, as we know, almost all the symptoms we have are self-limited, so it hardly mattered what in fact she did, but she felt that she provided comfort. And the other sphere in which women were dominant at that stage, of course, was childbirth. Women delivered other women's babies. Men did not get involved. But what happened over the next couple of hundred years, we will move through fairly quickly, but if you want me to give you some sort of coherent thread, I will attempt to do that. Susan did not explicitly say it, but I can tell from reading her work that she was interested in a certain class or a subset of women. If you think about it, looking around the world, half of the population is female, and the vast majority of those people are involved in some form of growing activity, gardening or otherwise, to stay alive. You planted your vegetables or you didn't eat. That is not the sort of woman that Susan had in mind when she talked about women in gardens. She was talking about the kind of woman who did not need to get down and dirty like that, who had a relatively comfortable life, who could pay other people to do that, but who was driven by a need to make a garden. So what happened to this comfortable arrangement where the women were running their gardens and taking care of their families? Well, to put it very simply, men happened. Because while women were not educated in any way, men were beginning to unravel the great Greek classics that were coming through. When Byzantium fell, the scholars traveled west and took their precious manuscripts with them. And all kinds of new information was coming to light. And men were the ones who took charge of it. They had the education, they had the leisure, and they were able to combine with each other to form institutions, to set up places of learning. And very slowly and very gradually, they began chipping away at women's own proper domain, that of the family physician. And later on, I haven't the time today, but we could talk, it's in the book, about the childbirth as well. You had men midwives appearing at the end of the 16th century. But very slowly and sort of invisibly, women began to lose this hold that they had on this one particular facet of their lives. And we are going to take today to check and see how they were able to restore it, what was needed for women to try and reach equality with men. And here I'm getting a little bit oratorical, because the theme really behind Susan's work, and by association this book, was how women reclaimed some measure of equality. And before we go any further, I want to make clear that everybody understands women are still not fully equal with men. In this country alone, the Equal Rights Amendment, which was started out in 1971 in Congress, has still not been fully ratified by all the states. And some states which had initially ratified it are now trying to de-ratify it. So that just gives you a picture. The rights and capacities women now have been conceded to them, in some cases somewhat grudgingly, by men. So now, if we could go back to the second slide, go back to the cover of the book, and then go on to the next slide, please, Joe. That's not the next slide. Well, go one more. One more after that. And after that, the next one after that. Here we are. This is a very interesting place. And I'm using it to illuminate how women in the 16th and 17th centuries were able to express their interest in gardening. It wasn't simply the residential domestic garden, but these were wealthy women. In this case, it was a mistress of the French king who created one of these gardens. Henry II of France had Diane de Poitiers as his mistress for very many years. And he built this chateau of Chenonceau, which is in the Loire Valley. as a gift to her when she lived there. Things were just lovely. And then he died. And before you could catch your breath, his widow had booted out Diane de Poitiers, taken control of Chenonceau, and to show who was boss, she built a second garden. If you can see here, there are two, and there's even a third garden, but there are more than one garden at the chateau. This was the revenge of the widowed queen on her rival. If we could go to the next slide. We now leap ahead a little bit into the 17th century and early 18th century. This is Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, and I suspect most of you have heard of her. She was distinguished in her own right as a writer, as a poet. She had a formidable garden. When she was a young woman, she eloped with a man whom her father disapproved of, and that man later became the British ambassador in Constantinople to the Sublime Porte. Lady Mary was a very, very lively, curious, open-minded woman. She didn't stand on ceremony. She didn't pull her rank. She loved visiting the Turkish ladies in their harems. And she very quickly noticed that they had smooth, unpitted complexions. She herself had had smallpox. Her brother had died of it. And she asked the Turkish ladies, how do you avoid it? And they explained to her that their doctors took a small amount of matter from a smallpox pustule and rubbed it into a small scratch on the skin of somebody else. And that person then was inoculated, or as we now say, variolated, and in a very large percentage of cases survived perfectly satisfactorily and was safe from smallpox. So now we have a lady, highly self-educated, who had made a very important contribution to medicine, to general medicine. But in general, what was going on in medicine and other spheres, professional spheres, was the men had taken charge. They took those herbs that the cottage lady and the other ladies were growing, for hundreds of years, and they laid them out in a systematic fashion in what was known as a physic garden. It was the lab of the then medical school. Now, general medicine, as we know it, was very primitive. Very, very little was actually available. And in fact, they depended on plants for the next 300 odd years. It really was not until 1899 when aspirin appeared. Aspirin was the first chemically developed medicine, nothing to do with the original plant. It was the first synthetic medicine, and it ushered in a modern phase. So the men were gradually taking away from the women their self-respect and their roles as physicians. And as I had said earlier, men were able to do that because they understood the requirements of organization to develop institutions. Women were precluded from that. They were very isolated, if you think about it, each one in a castle or in a busy town, much too preoccupied with childcare and daily life to do anything like sit quietly and think about philosophy or, systematic treatment of scientific information. Just wasn't on. They couldn't possibly do it. The men were able to do it. So gradually they took away the herbal remedies and sorted them out and made them into systems. And one of the key factors of modern scientific effort is systematic classification. It sounds dry and dull, but for example, if you think about cancer in the last 50 years, the big advances that have been made in cancer are not only because somebody had a brilliant idea or a Nobel laureate developed something new, but because painstakingly, the doctors began sorting out the different stages of the disease, and they began to treat like with like. And the mere fact of doing that, even using existing methods, meant that they made tremendous strides. So systematization organization are the lead words here. Can we go on to the next slide? I'm jumping ahead a little bit further now to the end of the 18th century. During the 18th century, you are familiar, of course, with the great English parks that were developed. You know of Capability Brown, there was William Kent, there was Bridgman, all men and all employed by men. And all that remarkable achievement is recorded very accurately, very carefully in historical writings. Susan was not impressed. She looked much more deeply. She studied correspondence between various women. And she found that while the men were off, raising millions of yards of soil to make a new park, the women were closer to the house, up on the terrace maybe, or in flower beds near the house, planting out perfectly lovely gardens of their own. But the property didn't belong to the women, and nothing about what they did was considered to be of any importance. They simply went unrecorded. These two women were fascinating. They were the great scandal of their day, both unmarried daughters of Irish noble families, Lady Eleanor Butler and Miss Sarah Ponsonby. And they happened to prefer the company of each other than being married to some man or other. And they had to leave home because it couldn't be tolerated the way they were living. They wandered around from Ireland and they ended up on the island of Anglesey in the north coast of Wales, which is a very beautiful and wild island. They settled there and they laid out what became a really famous garden. And Susan has looked into their correspondence, their diaries, and shown what complicated planting schemes they had, how their lives were devoted to their gardens. So all through these eras, although I've talked about a variety of other topics which seem remote, women were gardening. Now, with this, I'm sort of coming up to the 19th century, in the middle of it, which I find to be the most fascinating part of this whole topic. If you show me the next slide, it'll tell me what I want to say. Okay, Dorothy Wordsworth, William Wordsworth's sister. We know that she lived with him in a cottage up there in the Lake District. And while he was out wandering around with his daffodils and writing his poetry, Dorothy was minding the house. Dorothy used to write when she had time, but she planted a garden. She was very well known for her garden, and when people like De Quincey and all those others came from London to visit Wordsworth, she was their hostess. So we're opening up beginning of the 19th century. Next slide, please. Now we're into another part of this story. Jane Loudon was married to John Loudon, and John Loudon was the most noted horticulturist of his epoch. He was a very poor Scottish boy who made good by very hard work. The classic case of half the British Empire run by Scots of that ilk. And many of the great gardeners of London and the major cities were in fact originally poor Scottish boys who'd come up the very hard way. And Loudon was very, very gifted. He had a brilliant eye, he had encyclopedic knowledge, and he was driven by incredible energy. And John Loudon wrote a famous encyclopedia of gardens and gardening. When he married his wife, it was because she herself was a writer. She had written a science fiction fantasy called The Mummy, which she set from whatever it was, 1815 into 2115. So she wasn't far off, and she had an amazing imagination. Anyhow, those two got together, and they were the English powerhouse of horticulture and gardening. After he died, and she had to support herself, she recycled what he had taught her, and she wrote a number of very important books. The Lady's Flower Garden, How to Plant Your Garden. She began writing for the class of women who Susan really had been thinking about. Women who perhaps lived in a small house in a big town with maybe, a quarter of an acre or even less. There were women in small towns who had much more space. And there were, of course, noble women who had large estates. Things were moving on. However, the changeover in the social and political aspects of life for women was extraordinary in the 19th century. One really could say the 19th century was a tremendous exception to the path on which women had been following. I mean, they had always had to behave themselves. They had always had to be careful about their social position, but they were allowed to be a little freer. Their clothing was more comfortable. They were allowed to participate in lectures if they had a mind to it. They could not, of course, join a profession, but they could learn and listen and have conversations. You're familiar with Dr. Johnson and his conversaciones with Mrs. Thrale, who held her own in all sorts of topics. Mind you, Dr. Johnson wasn't at all interested in the idea of women actually doing anything. When he was asked for his opinion about women as preachers, you remember what he said? He said, "It's not surprising that it isn't well done. What is surprising is to find that it's done at all, like a dog walking on his hind legs." I quote Dr. Johnson and his opinion of women. Nevertheless, women began to find a way around this. They were not allowed to learn difficult subjects. They were not trained in the classics. They were not allowed to learn mathematics or chemistry. Men thought that women's brains were fragile. The actual brain itself was not capable of handling this degree of information or the degree of calculation or whatever process is required to learn something. They really sincerely believed that a woman's brain was not up to it. In fact, they never thought of women really as fully mature adults at all. Of course, very few of them had met my headmistress at my school, and very few of them knew the abbesses of great convents and monasteries who ran congregations of 150, 200 people perfectly well. However, let's leave them to their delusions. That's what they thought women were like. But there was one science which slid in very gently, hardly being noticed. It was not complicated or difficult. It didn't expose the women to unpleasant, vulgar sights. Didn't require a great deal of calculation. I'm referring to botany. So in the beginning of the 19th century, botany as an acceptable subject for a very well brought up young lady who was otherwise utterly and totally useless because of her lack of education. She began to go out and collect wildflowers, press them into albums, and then other women began painting them. So women became flower painters. This was at a time when there were several very important journals of horticulture which were published for a broad audience, which had black and white pictures. And the painting of each picture by hand was a very important task. It made them much more beautiful. At least the front picture of Curtis's Journal of Botany, which ran for more than 200 years, had hand-painted pictures, and the women were useful in painting those pictures. It was a very boring, deadly job, and it was very badly paid, and their names were never recorded. But for the women involved, it was a lifeline. Next slide, please. I come now to a very well-known botanist, but it isn't for botany that she's remembered. When she was a young woman, her family used to spend their summers up in Northumberland, and she was a very ardent student of botany, and she made several very significant discoveries. She found out about the structure of lichens, what they were really made of. She drew beautiful pictures of them. She wrote a paper on this subject, but could not get it produced, could not get it read anywhere. No society, the Royal Society, Royal Horticultural Society, or whatever society it was the slightest bit interested in hearing from a woman, no matter what the material was. She was able to hand it off to a distant relative, a scientific member of her family, and he undertook to get it read at the Lindley Society. But by the time all that happened, Beatrix Potter had moved on, and you know the rest of that story. We have next picture, please. Next slide, please. This lady was a powerhouse, and she really exemplifies what I've been getting at all along. She's not much to look at. I would say she was beyond frumpy, but she was brilliantly educated, had a remarkable mind, and she was very gifted in her ability to write. During the 19th century, gardening was very stultified. I don't know if you've seen pictures of it, but great bedding out with hundreds of thousands of petunias and begonias and whatever it was in a row. Municipal gardening at its worst is a relic of Victorian gardening. It was very, very time consuming and very labor intensive. Those displays had to be changed several times a year. A very peculiar Irishman by the name of William Robinson didn't like what he saw, and he was not afraid to express his opinion. And he decided single-handedly to get rid of that way of doing things. He wrote a very seminal book, The English Garden, in which he laid out a whole different way of doing things. And it is what we've inherited from Robinson and Miss Jekyll that really guides modern English gardening and much of the world's gardening to this day. Jekyll was trained as an artist at a time when going to art school was a very, very radical action for a young woman of good family. She came from an upper middle class family of means, but she was talented, and her father, unusual for a Victorian father, was happy to let her go to art school. She was very attentive to the lessons, but didn't quite have what it took to be an artist, qua artist. But she learned some of the basics of that, which led her in good stead. She learned about color. They were taught on the color wheel by a Frenchman, and she learned that a color on its own and a color next to another color are not the same thing. And Gertrude Jekyll joined William Robinson. She edited his journal, The English Flower Garden, for 30 years. She basically wrote most of it herself. She gave advice. She developed a garden for her mother after her mother was widowed. They moved to another house. Jekyll designed a garden for her mother, which became famous. Jekyll joined up with another well-known Edwardian figure, Sir Edwin Lutyens, the architect. He designed half of Delhi when the British Raj was still in place. And so by the early part of the 20th century, if you had a Lutyens house with a Jekyll garden, you were in a very good place. Miss Jekyll lived until her late 80s. She died at the age of 89 in about 1932, I think. A woman of immense importance in this story that I've been telling. Next one, please. I come now to another lady who was very important, very eccentric. Miss Jekyll was clever enough to hide all her originality and her incredible skill and her formidable gifts behind that very quiet exterior. She didn't frighten the horses. Now, here's another lady who was roughly her contemporary, who was of a very, very different sort. This lady was born into a prosperous commercial family. Her father had started out with a chemist's shop, developed a fleet of chemist shops, and they made money. And curiously, for England at that time, in that class, they were Catholics. And their godmother was a wealthy woman. So each birthday, this woman, Ellen, and one or two, I think she had two sisters, each were given a very large sum of money year after year. So very curious and very unusual. She had her own private money. Her father could not control how she spent it. And she began to spend it after her 21st birthday on gardens. They lived in Essex in a very beautiful estate with a lot of land, some of which was not developed. And she started out with a bang. She decided to redevelop a big section of the garden. Father was a very placid, complacent kind of mind, and he basically said, Ellen, as long as I don't hear the construction going on, you can get on and do whatever you feel like. So she built grottos, she moved rock, she imported plants, she created quite an amazing place. The family spent its holidays in the south of France, in Provence, and she was very, very taken with a small village near Aix-en-Provence. The next thing you know, she'd bought an estate in that village. This was simultaneous with her having a large garden still going in Essex. And by the way, she herself worked as hard as, if not harder, than the people who were managing her garden. And interestingly and amusingly, she had no opinion of women gardeners. She wouldn't let anyone near the place. Only she and her men gardeners were allowed to work. So she developed an incredible garden in the south of France, which was known for its roses. She wrote a very fine book, a monograph on roses. At home in England, she was a great authority on daffodils. She was invited to join the Royal Horticultural Society Daffodil Committee, which she contributed to for the rest of her life. She was pretty busy. She was outstanding. She was quite unique. But wait, you haven't heard it all. While they were visiting the south of France, they would occasionally travel across into the north coast of Italy, where she fell in love with a third garden. Yes, Miss Wilmot had 3 gigantic gardens. She employed more than 100 men over the 3 of them for years simultaneously. She would travel from one to the other. Quite astonishing woman. Let's go on now to the next. I come now to a very interesting woman, the Countess of Wolsey, Lady Frances Wolsey. As I've been telling you about some of these unique figures, I have not gone back into the more general aspect of what was happening to women in England during that same period. The very bizarre phenomenon of what was called surplus women began to emerge. Now, demographically, that was rubbish. Women life expectation was below that of men for centuries. It only improved after childbearing became safe and they stopped dying having babies. So there was never really a surplus of women. What there were women in certain types of family who had no opportunity to marry, who were therefore left dependent on the family. And if the father died, they were cut adrift with almost nothing to support them. But they were from these middle and upper middle class families, but they were ladies. A lady was not able to go and earn a living in those days. Oh yes, she could become a governess or a companion. And that was more like a living death. Just remember your Jane Eyre. So that was all the choice they had. Otherwise, they sat very sedately, nicely wrapped up, and very pure. No vulgar thoughts ever crossed their minds, half starved and half frozen. If you remember in the Mikado, that wonderful song, and we are his sisters and his cousins and his aunts, his sisters and his cousins and his aunts. That was the set of women that Lady Wolsey was concerned about and was marked out, not only in England, but in other countries too, as a set of surplus women. No one ever talked about surplus men. Men always somehow grubbed along and managed. But they were concerned socially about these women who had no means of earning a living. This is now toward the end of the second half of the 19th century. And Lady Wolsey and another countess, you'll see soon, both came up with the same idea. They thought if they could take these women and teach them how to become professional gardeners, that they could earn a very respectable living and not lose caste. So this woman started a school near her estate in South Sussex. And I think the next picture is of Lady Countess of Warwick. The next picture, yeah. This is Lady Warwick, who also was an heiress in her own right, who spent her entire fortune eventually on not only schools of gardening, but other forms of educating young women of class to be able to earn a respectable living and not lose face. So we have this curious phenomenon. It's in the book. Eventually, there was something like 32 of these schools in England. There were similar schools in English-speaking countries, a few in Canada, a few in Australia. On the continent of Europe, there were some. I think if we look at the next slide, Joe, this is a German feminist, a very powerful figure in German women's history. She wrote a book called The Yellow Pamphlet, and she too was concerned about the plight of the unmarried woman who couldn't earn a living respectably without losing caste. She was very strong on general education, educate the women, and they will be able to earn a living. Next slide, please. This is a German lady, a dentist, who listened to Helene Lange. Dr. Kastner had come to the United States and become a dentist. Still wasn't possible yet in Germany. She then went back to Berlin to start her practice. But she was sitting at a port city, I forget which one, whether it was Frankfurt or Hamburg, one day, nothing to do with dentistry, she was just visiting. She noticed them offloading huge crates of American apples. And she thought to herself, that's daft. We can grow very nice apples right here in Germany. And she kept hold of that thought. And eventually she and her mother bought a big plot of land next to the house where she practiced her dentistry. And she opened up a school of horticulture for young German women. So this was not just an Anglophone phenomenon, it was becoming somewhat more general. There are other European cases. I'm not going to waste your time on too much of it, just to tell you that this was a movement that was beginning to expand out of purely the British Empire and the United States. We've got some more pictures. Next picture, please. We come now into even more modern times. Another person I'm sure you're all familiar with, Beatrix Farrand. She designed the famous estate at Dumbarton Oaks. She was the niece of Edith Wharton, the great writer. This woman was Beatrix Jones. Edith Wharton was born Jones. And this woman, Beatrix, who therefore had plenty of money and resources behind her, wanted to become a landscape architect. Now, the women who were going to those schools that I mentioned earlier were being graduated. They were taking the examinations given to men by the Royal Horticultural Society or other institutions of the same type. And some of them went on to become garden designers, but it was a hit or miss thing. Beatrix Farrand really wanted to become an official, a formal professional person. So because of her family connections, she was able to attach herself to Dr. Sargent at the Arnold Arboretum, which is now part of Harvard, and studied with him and hung out her shingle as a landscape architect. She eventually ended up, when she married Max Farrand, and he was appointed the curator of the Huntington estate, where she lived and worked for many years of her life. Didn't get on very well with the head gardener, who wanted no part of her. And she, for her turn, thought of him as that German curmudgeon. There's not much friendship lost there. A very significant figure. She really was probably the first professional American landscape designer. At that time, there were no places for women to learn landscape architecture. Today, they form at least 50% of most of the standard school classes, and maybe even more. A huge advance, but she led that charge. Next one, please. Closer to home, now we're here in Sonoma County, and I'm sure many of you have been to Quarry Hill, which has been renamed in the last year the Sonoma Botanical Garden. This place is unique. All this fabulous forest that you see here, all these huge trees, were all grown from seed, which were collected in the wild, mainly from China, but to some extent from Japan and Korea, Taiwan, and then grown in nurseries and planted out into what at that time was a boring old quarry. Next slide, please. This lady, Jane Davenport Jansen, was the sponsor. She had the idea of taking an ugly old boring quarry and planting it out. And this, in her mind, also adding to the value of conservation, Mrs. Jansen created this phenomenal garden. So women were coming to the garden creation in several routes. One was becoming professional landscape architects and other this route. The next slide, please. This is another very famous garden. I have been there, many perhaps of you have been there, in Victoria, Vancouver. It too was a quarry. Mrs. Bouchard's husband, Mr. Bouchard, was the owner of Portland Cement. And the material quarried from that location was ideal for his business. Poor Mrs. Bouchard was obliged to go and live in the back of Lyon, facing a very ugly quarry. But she too had an inspiration, and she caused this garden to be created. So she brought in, at that time, a very well-known Japanese designer. The garden is still there. It's still owned by the family. I think it's her great-granddaughter now. So women were very effectively creating gardens, either themselves or at one remove. Next, please. Here's Mrs. Bouchard. She looks a little sad. I hope she got more cheerful later on. Next picture, please. Now we're coming up into the 20th century. I've made this, of course, a very, very rapid canter just over the peaks of the information I want to convey to you, because it's just a matter of time. This lady was an English woman who also started a very important new trend in English gardening, which has been adopted worldwide. She was the daughter of a policeman in England. She was a very clever girl. She was able to get scholarships, to be well educated. And she married a man named Andrew Chatto, who had a nursery in Essex and was an authority on horticulture. He had studied with a very famous German horticulturist, Karl Förster, a man who in his day was the leader in advancing horticulture, from planting stuff that you chose because you liked it, to planting plants in a place where they would thrive, a whole different concept. So Andrew Chatto instructed his wife. Their nursery was in a very dry part of Essex. They had a dry garden. And classic of the lemons and the lemonade, Beth Chatto planted out a garden with drought-tolerant plants. This was really a very original thought that she had. And she wrote a book known as The Dry Garden, which became an instant classic. So here's another woman who single-handedly made immense changes in a generalized pursuit. She took English garden and turned it on its head. Gertrude Jekyll had done that, 80 years before. Now along comes Beth Chatto and does something of the same sort. Next slide, please. I now come to probably my favorite lady among all my finds. I haven't talked much about roses. They are everybody's favorite flower. And they were grown and bred primarily by men throughout the centuries. But by the end of the 19th and into the 20th century, there were women coming into this field. And one of the most interesting to me was Sister Mary Xavier. She was at the Presentation Sisters in Tasmania. She was a Tasmanian nun who grew and hybridized roses most of her adult life. She was a teacher. The Presentation Sisters are teaching order. And so she inculcated each graduating class of high school seniors with her love of and skill in roses. Sister Mary presented new hybrid roses year after year in the big rose show in Hobart. She won prizes, she won cups, and much more importantly, she sold these very good plants, which were demonstrated to be successful, and brought in income for the convent. Sister Mary Xavier, a very interesting figure. Next slide, please. Now, here's a lady of incredible importance who was born in England and ended up in Ottawa, in Canada. This is not a very flattering photograph, but it shows her as she was working in her garden. She was at the tail end of that period when unmarried women couldn't just go out and take a flat and get on with their lives. When her father and mother died, she had to go and live with her married sister because that was the only respectable thing to do. She had learned gardening as a child from her father, very active family with gardening. and she loved to do it. The married sister then decided to emigrate with her family and move to Ottawa. Isabella went with her. And what did she do? She went to the Ottawa, I forget the technical term, it was the Canadian Centre for Agriculture and Horticulture. It had, I forget his name now at this moment. And she asked for a job. Well, they were horror struck. Women working here, they had no category, they had no pay scale. What on earth were they going to do with her? But she was very persistent, very forceful, and they did eventually give way to her, and they took her on as a day laborer and set her to work in their garden. She very rapidly proved her mettle and went on to become famous for two kinds of flowers, which are still in existence. Perhaps the most famous were her lilacs. She took a look at the Ottawa winters, and lilac, which is relatively a tender plant, wasn't going to do very well. She set out to breed lilac that could tolerate Canadian life. But at the same time, she was very partial to lilies, and she produced plant after plant of incredibly beautiful hybrid lilies. She was a real force to be reckoned with. She became the consultant if a nursery or a farmer needed a question, a horticultural question. The Canadian government sent Isabella to answer the questions. And there is one absolutely fabulous story associated with that. A monastery congregation of Trappist monks on an island in the lake, Ontario, sent in a request for advice. So Miss Preston was dispatched to the monastery. Well, when the Trappist monk at the dock saw a woman coming, he just went into orbit. That island was so anti-female, they didn't even have female sheep or hens. They had to go and buy their eggs and buy their meat from another colony or another congregation. So it is recorded that he was very polite. He kind of walked her around for a little while until the next ferry came back, and then she bundled her off back to Ottawa. She never did get to consult and tell him how to help his problem. Next slide, please. Another Canadian lady of great importance. She was born and grew up in Vienna, in Austria. She was not a Jewish woman. At some point in the 1930s, she left Vienna and immigrated to Canada, and she was in the same department, agricultural department, as Isabella, we just talked about. And they set this woman a task of breeding a rose which would survive Canadian winters. Again, roses don't do very well above a certain latitude. And she set to, and she achieved it. And again, the roses she bred are still available for sale because they work. She had infinite patience. I haven't gone into a great deal of detail about what plant breeding involves. It's not simply that you take the pollen of one and put it on the ovary of another. You've got to be prepared to wait 5, 7, 10 years for anything much to happen. You have to have what my son's music teacher called industrial supplies of patience. Meanwhile, you're very busy with many other activities, but that particular little plant that you're watching is going to take a very long time to come to fruition. I do not believe these two women crossed paths. I think the times that they were there were sufficiently different, but I like to imagine that they might have done. Next slide, please. Here I don't have a picture of a lady, another flower breeder. These are these beautiful yellow magnolias. The natural magnolia is a beautiful pink, varying shades of pink, and they're also white. But left to itself, magnolias don't grow yellow. It took the genius of this lady, a German lady who immigrated to the United States and ended up at the Brooklyn Botanical Garden, Eva Maria Sperber, to develop these beautiful yellow magnolias, which you are now beginning to see something more of them. I think there may be just one or two more slides. Where are we? Next one. Another lovely rose bred by a lady. I again couldn't find a picture of her, but you all know the peace rose, which was saved, which was smuggled out of France right at the end of the war so the Germans wouldn't get it, ended up being developed in California. And it was released in 1945 and given the name of peace. That was developed, that was bred by Antoine Moya. The Moya family goes back generations in flower breeding and nursery care. when Antoine died, his widow, Madame Antoine Mayon, bred other roses and carried on the family business. I think there may be just one or two more, I'm not sure. Yeah, we're coming now to the United States, and I'm leaping back a little bit, you'll have to forgive me, into landscape architecture. Florence Yock was a California girl. She was born on the coast somewhere down just south of Los Angeles, grew up a very free spirit. Family was very open-minded. She was allowed to roam. She was a tomboy. She became very interested in plants and nature and gardens. And so she managed to get an education, I think at UCLA, and become a landscape architect. And the gardens of the 1920s, if you've ever seen pictures of the beautiful gardens of Los Angeles, nowadays, we up here in Northern California tend to look down our noses a little bit at Los Angeles, but Los Angeles is full of immense beauty, of phenomenal gardens. Its peak probably was in the 20s and 30s. Florence Yock designed large numbers of gardens for film stars, but she is most remembered because she designed the sets for Gone with the Wind. A very interesting lady, very important contributions. Is there any more? One more picture? This is another facet which I added to the book. It sort of doesn't particularly come from anywhere, but intrigued me. Some women writers tend to make the garden almost a character in the book. I think you remember in The Return of the Native, how the mayor of the city and the Heath, Egbert Heath in Hardy, had really much the same role in the book. The Heath was as much a character in the book as the mayor. But in general, that wasn't a male way of writing. But women writers, gardening was, and the garden could be recognized almost as a character in the book. If you think of the beginning of Rebecca, Daphne du Maurier's noir classic, the poor young lady who's married into a situation she has no idea about gets a kind of a hint when her husband drives her through the gates into his estate at Manderley, and there are these huge overhanging rhododendron forests closing in over. The garden itself had become a character. Elizabeth von Arnim was a New Zealand, an Australian woman, incredibly talented. Family took her to Europe to study and learn. She was a concert level pianist, but of course wasn't allowed to perform in public because well brought up, refined, respectable ladies didn't play in public. But because of her beautiful piano playing, she was snapped up by a Bavarian Count von Arnim, and was taken off to live with his family in Berlin. Well, here was a free spirit used to getting things done how she liked and given every opportunity. Suddenly in this stultifying, claustrophobic environment in a respectable German family. Fortunately, the Graf von Arnim had a country estate. She went out there, thankfully, and she basically just lived there. He would come and visit from time to time, but she and her 3 daughters lived out there, and she wrote this book, Elizabeth and Her German Garden. And as it is very much, the garden is the principal character in the book. You may remember her because she also wrote 2 novels, both of which became very successful films. One was an early film with Betty Davis called Mr. Skeffington, and the other was about, I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago, An Enchanted April, a wonderful film about women taking a vacation together away from their husbands. So that was Elizabeth von Arnim. Next one. That's the end. Okay, I've talked myself out. It's 5 minutes to 12.
Good timing there, Judith. Thank you very much.
Sure.
And now we will turn to our question and answer period. We'll go as long as there are questions. I know we're generally running till about noon, but we can run a little bit over if people have questions. So feel free to use your chat feature or or raise your hand or Q&A, and we will take your questions.
Judith, question here, where can we get your books?
It's online.
Thank you.
Online, Amazon, and a number of other booksellers carry it.
Thank you. Wonderful show. Thank you very much.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. I had fun presenting it.
I do know you have several fans out there. They were excited to hear as soon as it was announced.
Good. That's great.
Let's see. And you have, let's see, Lisa says, hello, dear Judith.
That's nice.
And we'll see. I enjoyed seeing Beatrix Potter. That was a name I recognized. I admit many were unfamiliar to me, but I knew that name.
Well, the purpose of having a book like this out there has many functions. One of them is to capture information, to share it, and pass it on. It's information that is of great importance. My hope is that other people will pick up where I've left off. I've left a lot of openings there. There's a lot of places which need a lot more filling in. And I just hope that somebody else will be inspired to carry on this work.
Do you have another book underway?
Not now. Not now.
And
We don't see a question, but a nice compliment. Wonderful presentation. Proud to be a friend and fan.
Oh, thank you very much.
My name's Fran, and this is another Fran, so nice to see.
She's a lady.
Yes.
and okay. We have
Leonard is my cousin. Hi, Len.
yes, cousin Len. And then there's, I apologize. I think I saw somebody may have raised their hand, but then maybe they switched it to something else.
Right, they might have.
Yeah. And, you know, our organization, the Moya Library Ross Historical Society, we are closely associated with the Marin Art and Garden Center in Ross. And of course, Caroline Livermore is a very big figure. And of course, Magnolias. I saw you talk about Magnolias. Are you familiar with Caroline Livermore?
No, I'm not. But I am looking at a question in the chat from Elise Sparks.
Right, I can read it to you, but you can see it yourself.
You read it.
For
So you can see.
those who don't see it, if someone was interested, they didn't see Vita Sackville West. Do you think she is well known enough?
She is absolutely well known, but as I said just now, there is a lot that I couldn't include. She's in the book. She was the center of fabulous scandals. I mean, newspapers circulation depended on Vita Sackville West. She was technically, she should have inherited the great estate of Knoll in Kent, but she wasn't a man, so it went to a distant cousin. She felt that very bitterly. She was brilliantly talented. She was a poet. She was a writer, but she's noted particularly for having built at least 2 famous gardens, and also she took to heart the teachings of Gertrude Jekyll. Remember, I talked about Gertrude Jekyll and her interest in color. Vita Sackville West was very, very interested in applying those precepts. And from Vita Sackville West, we get the idea of the individual colored garden. For example, many, many, many people all over the world grow a white garden because of Vita Sackville West. Unfortunately, although she was married to a very distinguished English diplomat and politician and had at least 1 son, she was primarily attracted to women, and she was active with Virginia Woolf. We could go on, but that's Vita Sackville West.
Yes. Lisa has raised her hand. So Lisa, if you're still there, let me bring you in. And I think there are some others after her. So, hello, Lisa, can you hear us?
Meeting, and I just put it in chat as well. I'm also lucky to be a friend and fan of Judith's. But I think what is particularly remarkable about this book is, and all of Judith's work, is the blending of the subject here, you know, gardens, women's gardens, whatever, with the social, political, economic or within that context, the social, political, economic context of the times. She brings such a broad range of experience and knowledge, and doesn't look at things, you know, just from women gardens, but everything that surrounded that. So, thank you.
Well, I appreciate it, Lisa. Very, very kind of you. Thank you.
Yeah, if I could add from Joe's earlier comment, the Marin Art and Garden Center recently had a National Register nomination, and it made a big point of the local angle of women in gardens. But I think this is great to have your much longer timeline here and perspective. So thank you for that.
The idea that Susan Bell had was in 1976. We're talking 45 years ago. In that interval, women's studies have moved on, and scholars have been looking very much into gardens as an expression of women's history. And there are all kinds of fascinating theoretical issues that they bring up. As I said right at the top of this thing, you define a garden by its being enclosed. Well, if it has an enclosure, it has to have an opening. And so you can read papers which are fascinating on the importance of the garden gate. For example, the great Arabist Gertrude Bell, who had an unhappy love affair and soothed herself by studying Arabic, I kid you not, and then decided to go off traveling across what is now Iraq. It's because of her that it's called Iraq. She says that she started out her journey by going out of the garden gate. So yes, all sorts of fascinating aspects, philosophical and so on, scholars are now applying to the study of gardens. And it's important, and it's very good that they should do that.
Well, let's see. Fran, do you see any other questions? I think we've
covered it, but very interesting to see. And thanks for kicking off our season.
You're very welcome.
Yes. And I'd just like to add that we did record this entire presentation from beginning to end, and it will be available on our organization's website in a couple days. Everybody who attended this program will get an email, and you'll have instructions on how you can visit our website and learn more about our organization, and go back and look at this and other presentations that we've offered in the past. So,
very good.
Yes.
Very good indeed.
Well, thank you again, Judith.
All right, thank you very much.
And thank you everybody for joining us today. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time.
All right, thank you.
All right.